me to your house.
Good evening, guys. How's it going? Trust you're all well. I hope you can hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Woo, thumbs up everywhere, all over. Love it. Lovely to see you guys. It's wonderful to have you all joining us again. I was chatting with Ames this week, Couch Time Vibes, and we were just saying that we are just so clear in our minds how important a ministry this time is, what an important investment this time is. This is for ourselves. I think the third or fourth time we've actually been on the course, but each time we really have gained something different, and as we've gone through the different stages of parenting, God has challenged us on different areas. So we really feel that this is nothing less than an investment in your guys' parenting. So I really want to say well done for making the effort, making the time. I know even with the days of lockdown, life is busy, and I've no doubt some of you have been busy, like Ames is busy right now, trying to settle kids and get them to sleep and whatnot. But it is really great to see you all. So well done for making it. I just want to open in a word of prayer, and then I'll hand over to Rich and Sheila, who are going to, of course, be leading us this evening. So if you want to just bow your heads, close your eyes, open your eyes, however you like to pray. Lord, we just thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your wisdom and for your truth, Lord. I thank you that you can and you do speak to us, Lord God. You have a thought about every area of life, every issue we face, and of course, Lord God, this incredibly massive calling that you have given each of us who are here this evening, Lord God, of being parents. You have thoughts about that, Lord God, and you have ways to lead us in that. And so we really want to open our hearts to you tonight, Lord God, not just to be gaining information, not just to be not just to get an understanding. We want to grow in that, but we want our hearts and our lives to be changed and transformed, because we want to be the kind of parents to our kids like you are to us, Father. So we open our hearts to you, and we really trust that you will speak to us, Lord God, with your wisdom and with your truth and with your strategy tonight, Lord, for each one of us. And I just want to pray over each one of the families that are represented here, whether the families are just a couple at this stage, or even just a single. But I want to thank you for each person and each life and each family that's represented here. And I really want to pray for your fruitfulness, and for your fullness of life for each person and each family represented here tonight, Lord. So we thank you for this, and we thank you for Rich and Sheila and the blessing that they are. And we do open our hearts to you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Hello, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
Brian, can you just give us some options to record? It seemed to need some permission from you for me to do that. Okay, good. Right, so if everybody can just stay on mute, that'd be great. And then if you are new, because we had a couple of new folk joining us, if you would like to ask questions during the time, just send Brian Fazale, there he is there, a chat message, and he will pass them on to us, and then we'll try and address them as best we can. And we also, as has been our practice, we would have a time of questions afterwards. So at 8:30 we will land, and then if you have questions, you're welcome to stay and ask specific questions or just chat. That's fine. So here we are once again, night 3. We are focusing on vision. So we are trying to lift our eyes from the daily detail of our parenting and looking down the line of what it is to be parents of young adults and what they're going to look like when they emerge from our good care. As I heard somebody once say, it's harder to raise the dead than it is to raise adults, young adults. And so we'll do our best. And just very quickly, what we spoke about last week were the principles of parenting, and the ones that we focused on. There were 6 of them. We spoke about how discipline, the goal of discipline, the aim of discipline is to shape the heart. We are always aiming at shaping the heart. We're not trying to punish or get revenge with our children in any way. We spoke about how there is only one standard for any area of parenting, whether it be for kindness or self-control or anger management, whatever it might be. We don't allow our children's temperament or personality to dictate the moment, but rather actually we would parent them towards a standard that God sets. We spoke at quite length about the need for family-centered parenting, where children are a welcome addition to the couple, or even if it's a single parent, mom or dad, and they are not the center of the family. So the world does not revolve around them. And actually one of the goals of our parenting course is to train selfishness out of our children. So we don't want to emphasize it through by allowing them to think that they are the center of the universe. So we do that. We do not advocate child-centered parenting or anything like that. We do not advocate authoritarian parenting, where it's all about rules, but family-centered parenting with God at the center of it all. We spoke a bit about proactive parenting, trying not to be in reaction to a whole lot of moments, and we will probably speak a lot more about that tonight, so I won't spend any more time on that. We spoke about how we want to have privileges and freedoms that are earned in response to demonstration of self-control. So we are wanting to, that's so children don't get everything that they want from a young age. And then lastly, we want to deal with, we've spoken about this in every session, about this business of parental vision and unity, and we really want that to be the case.
I can't remember what I was going to say. Go for it.
Sheila was going to say something. Right. So what we want to talk about tonight is really to do with the very practicality of discipline. And we'll note that our children do not come pre-programmed with morality, with their consciences intact, and with self-control. So your children, very much like these are not natural instinctive behaviors. Our children do not come with a knowledge of right from wrong. They do not yet know how to listen to that inner voice of their conscience. Even as adults, we fail in this sometimes. We may know right from wrong, but we choose not to respond to that inner voice, that prompting of the Holy Spirit or our conscience dealing with us. And we also are not naturals at self-control. And all of us know this. I mean, if you think back through your life, there are some spectacular lapses of self-control that you could wish you could unwind. I'm sure I've got some, all of us do. I mean, that's the nature of being human. And so we mustn't be surprised when our 2-year-olds and whatever age are exhibiting the absence of all of the bottom line is we shouldn't be surprised when our young children are lacking all of these things. Just because we do it, even to this day, we don't fully live out what we would love for ourselves. So the whole point of our parenting and where we're going with our discipline and what we're talking about tonight and next week is going to be how do we shape our children's hearts through the process of discipline. And I said this last week, but it's a point I really need to emphasize again and again. We as parents mustn't be shy to be very strong heart shapers or disciplinarians. Unfortunately, the word has become to mean harsh, or people who are focused on punishment and getting every little detail of our children's lives sort of in correction to bad behavior. That's not what we talk about when we mean discipline. Discipline means you are highly intentional as a parent. You are aiming to see every moment shape their hearts so that after the 18 or so years that you get with your kids, they emerge under control, under their self-control, and it's so it's very, very important. There's also a multi-generational aspect to this, which is really important. Some of the scriptures in Deuteronomy talk about the shaping of the morality of our children. They say, teach them what you know about right from wrong, and then teach. So there's one generation being taught. Then it says, tell your children to teach their children. In other words, even the scriptures are looking long-term down the generations, and we would say to you the same, is that even while you are parenting your young children, start emphasizing even now that one day when they have their kids, they can also pass this on, and it'll be good.
So what we've done is using teachable moments now with our older children. We'll be in a situation and something will happen and they'll go, sure, Mum, what did you think of that? And then we'll go, yeah, well, perhaps there was a better way of doing it. So one day, when you're a mom or a dad, we recommend that you shape your children's hearts so that you don't see that behavior in them. And we keep on using teachable moments now with our young adults of when they're going to be mums and dads and saying, this is what you got to do. That's why you want self-control. That's why you want, even when we're watching movie stars or whatever and how they're behaving and we're having a comment on how they're living their lives, and then we'll say, yeah, so, you know, that's why you want to teach self-control to your children, is because of that. And so we try and facilitate discussions now with them. So, and then we also say to them, remember, you can't just assume that if your children grow up in a Christian household, that firstly they will get saved and be a Christian. It's a bit like going and sitting in the doctor's room and expecting to become a doctor. You have to do a little bit more than that. So we say to him, you've got to actually be very proactive in your parenting. And if you want your children to know Jesus, you need to tell them firstly. And secondly, you need to tell them to tell their children. So we sort of, we drip feeding that principle to our children.
Good. So I don't know if you've noticed, but when you know, as parents, your daily life is made up of thousands of split-second decision-making moments where you walk in on a scene and there's chaos, and you may have two or more children all denying that they were the problem, and the other one clearly is the problem, and you are, you know, it's quite something to be a parent negotiator and discerner of the heart. And you really have a few milliseconds to actually decide what you're going to do and who's right and wrong and whatever else. And so I suppose what we are wanting to do tonight is to try and help you with a framework, a way of thinking, is a better way to put it, a way of thinking about discipline that will help you really get to the heart of the matter. Because so that I have a few sort of classifications, if I can put it like this. We'll box things a little bit, but the reality is it's not a box, and it's just a way of thinking. And I'm sure it's been of great help for us. And in all of what you are dealing with your parenting moments, every single moment, especially when you're in reaction to a bad behavior or something that you don't like to see or whatever it might be, particularly so when you are in reaction to something. It may not be even in reaction to a specific moment, but you have a sense in your heart that there's something amiss with your child. And it may be an accumulation of lots of little things, or just even a suspicion of the heart, of the Holy Spirit warning you that there's something amiss. The key question is, what is going on in your child's heart? So the behavior, in a sense, is a symptom of something that's underlying it. And a lot of parenting can become very reactionary to symptoms, which obviously, even from a medical point of view, we would know it's not helpful just to teach, to deal with symptoms. You do need to get to the root matter, the heart of the matter. So the question that we want to deal with, we want the three sort of states that we categorize children's hearts into, we'll speak about now. But as I say, don't get too worried about the exact nature of boxes. I mean, we are humans, and we don't easily squash into boxes. Sometimes trying to understand exactly what you're dealing with is like squashing an octopus into a net bag. It's sort of these bits that stick out and crawl out and all the rest. So it's not easy all the time, but this will help you think about it. And when you chat about it in your next couch time, you can understand it yourselves. So there are 3 states, and we'll talk about them in some detail. There's rebellion. Is there rebellion in your child's heart? The next one is recklessness. Is your child being reckless? And we'll unpack what each of these mean. And then the last one is restless. Is your child's behavior because of a restlessness in their heart? And these concepts are and as I say, I'm going to unpack them in a moment, but these concepts are not entirely our own work. We had a similar thing, but we would really advocate a book that we find incredibly helpful. The teaching behind with it that is captured in this book by Drew and Megan Land. They are on eldership down at Glenridge, and the details are on the screen, and you can also we'll send them out on the group. So they unpack this to quite a lot of detail amongst many other things, and it's I could really recommend their material. So just to sort of honor their authorship of some of these
and
concepts.
We did ask them, and they said go for it.
So the big question now is discerning rebellion, recklessness, and restlessness. How do you tell the difference? And because you can have the same action, in other words, the same symptom can be the result of very different underlying heart problems or issues. So, for example, here we've got a cricket ball that's crunched somebody's window, and now that could be completely just reckless. It was just a moment of childishness, immaturity, unplanned moment. It also could be rebellion, where you might have said to that child, don't play there because of the cars in the car park, and they rebelled against your wisdom and instruction, and now there's a consequence. So often what we find, though, is that because of the severity of the symptom, we sometimes make an incorrect judgment. In other words, if this was your neighbor's Porsche and it was literally a 60 or 70,000 rand damage bill that suddenly raises its head, your temptation would be to react as if this was the worst state of rebellion you've ever seen in your child, because it's like a severe reaction. It's a big problem, and it is a big problem. But on the other hand, the child's heart is not necessarily in a state of rebellion. So we always want to sort of have consequences. There are always consequences to our actions, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But the reality is the heart matter is what you've really got to get down to. So what does this look like? If we were to start off with restlessness, these are sets of behaviors which emerge from, particularly in younger children, but actually even right through to adulthood, where out of tiredness or boredom, or in young children, particularly in hunger, some children out of loneliness, you get a negative behavior pattern. So, I mean, all of us have seen this. You know, if you're a young child, your toddler comes home from a birthday party at the dam, and they are sunburnt and dehydrated, and all they've eaten is sugary, preservative-filled nasties the whole day. Don't be surprised if you have a tantrum when you say, no,
they have the tantrum.
And you say it's bedtime, and they just have a complete hissy fit. It's nothing to do with the state of their heart. It's actually almost a biological thing, and they are just, it's termed restlessness. They're just unable to, you're never going to parent that moment, actually. The best thing is to put the child in bed and tie them down with Velcro and just wait until they go to sleep. We never did that, but it's the point being is that you get behaviors because of their circumstances and not what's going on in their heart. And actually, the parenting is much more circumstantial, changing the circumstances than anything else. So another good example is if you're seeing a lot of sort of ratty behavior from children, and they're permanently tired and grumpy and unhappy, and you're getting a lot of sort of negative behavior, it literally might be because they're not getting enough sleep. And so a simple adjustment to their sleep pattern might be the correct parenting response, as opposed to constantly trying to discipline their hearts. So that's the package of restlessness. Recklessness is really a lack of caution. It sometimes emerges from overly curious behavior without caution. It's neglectful. A child running through the home knocks over the side table, and there's glass everywhere. Sometimes it's peer influence, so they get caught up in a crowd of children who are doing something. Even it's not an evil behavior, it's just like they get caught up in the moment and they haven't thought about it. It's an immature thing and they just do stuff. And that's kids. That's immaturity. That's the process of maturing our families. And we want to react to those, because it's not right that children would run amok and do also and be without control. But the heart issue, the underlying heart issue is not a major problem. It's actually more of a teachable moment. Your response at that point is to bring them to maturity, to teach them about not being neglectful, how to be attentive to their surroundings and environment and other people. And so if they're charging across the church courtyard at coffee time and knocking elderly people flying, it's not necessarily, it's not a heart problem, it's just lack of attention to what's going on and the cares of others. So it's a different package of parenting. But I'm going through this relatively quickly because we are going to speak about this quite a lot. I'm trying to just unpack a bit of a theoretical background here. And then the last one is rebellion. So this is where it's absolutely willful disobedience. There's a problem in the heart. It can look deceptive, it can be manipulative. This would be lying or stealing or any sort of controlling behavior, having direct rebellion where there's just an outright sort of...
Or they just say no. You say, pack away your toys, and they go, no, that's rebellion.
So there's obviously that's a heart problem. It's an issue. And if you have time on your hands or make the time, go and look up what God's view on rebellion is in the scriptures. And it's very, very, it's a big issue. He goes so far as to call it, it's like the rebellion of, it's like witchcraft in our hearts, where we are rebelling against God's authority. And, the reality is, the goal of our parenting, certainly for Sheila and I, was that our children one day would learn to obey God, that they would have a relationship with God where they are attentive to his voice and able to respond and deal with the sort of natural rebellion that would be in their hearts. And so it's a very big thing to deal with rebellion. It's never let rebellious moments go.
So an example between rebellion and recklessness would be, for example, let's say your child runs through the house and there is a glass on the coffee table and they're just being childish, reckless, and they're having fun, and you stop them and you say, please be careful, because if you do that again, the glass is on the coffee table, so please don't do that because you might knock it over. Then now you've given them the specific instruction. And let's say half an hour later, they run through again. But now they know that actually they shouldn't run past the coffee table because they might knock a glass over. Even if they don't knock over the glass, the fact is they're actually in rebellion to what you've told them to do. So that's the difference between recklessness and rebellion. Rebellion was, well, I actually know the truth, but I'm choosing not to do what you told me to do or advise me not to do.
And I think what we would say is that at all costs, if you're going to get anything right out of tonight, it's get to know what rebellion looks like.
In your different children, because it will present itself differently for different kids.
And, as I was saying, the scriptures are quite clear that God does not tolerate rebellion. He deals with it very, very strictly. And so we as parents want to really set our children up for success so that they are not what the scriptures would call a fool, is somebody who is in a state of rebellion against God. We use the word quite lightly, but the scriptures are quite strict about it. And the bottom line is there's...
Are you screen sharing?
What do you mean? We have the three states of our children's hearts: restlessness, recklessness, and rebellion. So that's really what we're dealing with. And the first one, restlessness, is around circumstances, and you can maybe deal with it through circumstances. Recklessness you need to deal with, but there's a different set of tools that we'll talk about. But rebellion, that's the one that we're going to really try and focus on now. So at all costs, you really want to get to know what rebellion looks like. And so it can look like two things. It can be very active rebellion. In other words, open, it's defiance, it's deliberate, it's talking back with attitude. It's in young children, it'll be aggressive tantrums or clearly a selfish tantrum where they're not getting their way and they just have a complete sort of breakdown of attitude. But it can also be passive, where a child will pretend not to hear, they will sulk whenever they're corrected. It can even be cute disobedience. So your little toddler on the high chair and you've told them to sit and to eat their supper, and they put a big smile on their face and roll their eyes cutely and throw their supper on the floor. You know what I mean? Irrespective of how it's packaged, the skill of parenting in this arena is getting to know are you dealing with rebellion, because it's a very that's the thing that you really want to deal with in your parenting. You cannot let it slide. Rebellion, when there's moments of rebellion, it's very neglectful parenting to walk away from that. You can sometimes ignore reckless behavior if you choose to, if you're feeling like you're overwhelmed or something. But rebellion is well worth dealing with, and because that's the main issue. And I was thinking of an example of the necessity to really get to the heart of the matter. Is the symptoms can look like anything, any one of those states, but if you get the heart discernment wrong, you will parent incorrectly. So we had very good friends who had a child. He was 7 or 8 years old at the time, I think, and his mom asked him, "Please, will you take the compost bucket out to the compost heap?" And the compost heap was at the bottom of the garden. So he just looked at her and he said, "No, I won't do it." And she was a bit shocked, and this child was not necessarily characterized by open defiance, and so she was, what am I dealing with here? And anyway, he was disciplined in the moment because it was open defiance. He just said, "No, I won't do it," and he just took the, in this case, whatever it was, the consequences, and refused point blank to go to the compost heap. Anyway, it turned out some time later, it doesn't really matter how long, she was perplexed by his behavior. So she questioned him about it out of conflict much later on. And anyway, with a bit of probing, it turned out that he was really scared to go into the garden. And it was an issue of fear, but he was old enough not to want to be fearful, or to look fearful. So he to cover up his embarrassment, he just flicked into defiance mode. And even though the state of his heart was not rebellious, it was something else. So discernment of the matter is very important, and you can call on the Holy Spirit to help if you are struggling with particularly if you're worried about something. You must pray and ask God to show you the heart of your children.
The difference between active and passive is very clear, and it can be very different. I found parenting the passive rebellion harder than the active. So one of my children, if I said, "Pick up your toys," they'd look at me and go, "No." And it was quite clear that they were rebelling against me. Whereas another one of my children, I'd say, "Pick up your toys," and then we'd have like the go slow. And it would take them 5 minutes to pick up one piece of and put it in the bucket. But actually the root of it was they both had rebellion in their hearts. They just displayed it differently. And so I often found passive rebellion much harder.
But if you sense it's rebellion, and then you deal with it the same way in which you would deal open rebellion. It's the same heart issue. So your discipline is always going to be parenting the heart, not the behavior. And so if you sense it's there, if you sniff it out, then you deal with it. Right. So how do we do all of this? So one of the things we want to focus on is a concept which is called first-time obedience. And it's not just a completely theoretical topic. This is actually something that is attainable, within parenting, where your children obey you right away. They do everything that they are asked all the way, and they do it with a happy heart. And this might seem like the mythical Holy Grail, and it is hard work to get there, but you can do it. We've seen it to a degree, not to perfection, but you can really get your children to obey you. And the reason why it's so significant is that obedience is quite foundational to everything else in what we're trying to shape in our children's hearts. And so typically in any human, there's a state of either obedience or rebellion in their hearts. They're in one or other state, or in somewhere in between. You know, so and the nature of humankind is that the moment we are given instructions or rules or boundaries, there's an instinctive response to try to rebel against them. So, you know, the moment you are told you can't do this or you should do that, you'll think of all the reasons why it doesn't actually apply to you. I'm very good at this. I can justify many things why I should walk on the grass when there's a sign clearly for other people who don't know how to behave. And anyway, the point being is that that's a natural human thing. And so if you're trying to deal with rebellion, the opposite of it is obedience. You want to train your children to obey your voice and your instructions. And so everything we talk about tonight and even into next week is going to be how do we do this? And it's very, very important that they would do that. And I think a big part of this is to see the link with if you are a believer in Christ and you're wanting your children to have a similar relationship with God. Obedience is the key to following God. It's not the key, it's a key. It's important. God rates obedience to his voice very highly. And so in many cases would actually go so far as to say, if you love me, you will obey my voice. And so if you're wanting to see that transition for your kids in the future, it's important that from a young age they learn to obey your voice because they don't yet know God. And they will transition more easily into the obedience to God if they are obedient to you. Right. But I think very importantly, obedience is not the end goal. It's the starting point. Okay. So the risk is that you get very focused on achieving a high level of obedience in your kids. In other words, they become like highly trained dogs that at the slightest clearing of your throat or flicker of the eyebrow, you can get them to obey you. And you can achieve that through a good measure of rewards and or punishments. You can pretty much extract any behavior from your children. But you must know that obedience is really just the starting point of what you're aiming for in your parenting. I mean, it's not right that a late teen or a young adult, an 18 or 19-year-old, you know, if you just say, do this, that they would just do it. You know, because now they're their own person. It wouldn't, and it's not, you're not aiming for obedience that is exacted or pulled out of the person. You're aiming for what we might call the next level. You want to transition through a level called submission, where submission is different to obedience. Obedience is, if I give a command, I expect you to obey because of who I am as an authority. So it might be like that for younger children. When a parent gives a command to a 2-year-old, they don't have to explain themselves. They just say, this is what I want you to do, and the child should do it. And it's right that they should do it. But as the child grows and as the whole relationship emerges, you really want to transition to submission, where the child says, out of my love for you and out of my respect for you, I will voluntarily come under your instruction. In other words, there's a lot more of a voluntary nature to submission. That's what submit means, to come under something else. And it's a vitally important thing in life. You know, one day your children will have to submit to a boss, and it's much easier to submit than to have to obey when it comes to a boss and or any aspect of life. But even that submission is not a very high standard. Really, what you're aiming for is honor. Is when your children, out of their deep love and deep respect and a mutual recognition of our giftedness and our humanity and who we are as people, we are able to honor one another. And so the journey really is one of submission, obedience through to submission and through to honor, which is the end point. But the foundation, starting point, especially for young children, is they have to learn to obey you.
So an example of this we noticed in our daughter, when she was little, we just made a choice of encouraging her to dress in a way that would be appropriate when she was a teenager or a young adult, being a girl. And so the one day she had her favorite skirt, as you do when you're 4 or 5. And I hadn't noticed, but she'd had a growth spurt, and we were on our way to church, and she rushed out the door, and I saw her skirt had got sort of literally just covering the panty level. It was really high. And I'm thinking, oh, it's fine, you know, she's 5, 6, it really doesn't matter how short her skirt is. And I actually, to be honest, I didn't have the energy to parent it, so I actually just decided to turn a blind eye. But knowing, I had a wriggle, and knowing that I should actually say something, but it was just too much effort. And Richard came out, and he looked at her, and he said, oh gosh, Em, wow, isn't that amazing? You've grown so tall, but perhaps perhaps it might be a good idea that you change. And she looked at him, she said, okay, Daddy, which I was amazed because I thought we're going to have a huge fight now. And she ran and went and found something dress and said, now what do you say, Dad? And he was like, no, that's perfect, whatever she got into. And then we noticed as a teenager, she came to us once and then said, Mum, Dad, is this okay? Do you think I can wear this? Do you think this will be okay to wear? Not that she was trying to get our permission, because we never said what she could or couldn't wear. She said, is this too tight? Is this too short? Is this too revealing? And she actually came to ask our opinion. And then when she was older, a few years ago, we were able to have the most beautiful discussion where Richard explained to her how men are wired and that they're very visual, and that if you do wear very revealing, very tight, very short, very whatever, it's actually not very helpful to the guys around you, even though you have full freedom to express yourself as you dress. But there's actually a thing of honoring other people, that you don't cause them to stumble by what you're wearing. So it's not that you can't look fashionable or with it or nice, but there is a way of honoring. And we saw it come from obedience through to submission, now to honor. And even to this day, she's almost 20, she'll be going somewhere and she'll go to Richard and say, Dad, do you think this is okay? Do you think this will cause other people to stumble? And she genuinely asks him his opinion.
Sure. So that's really what you are wanting to have. So this is a process I'm going to try and take you through of what we often try to get our children to do. And it's a sort of a regularly followed path that many parenting moments will go through when we give an instruction. And the point I'm trying to make out of all of this is that obedience is not a natural response in children. So the first thing is we might try and coax our children into behavior. So we're like, oh, come on, guys. What about, how about we tidy up our toys, and we make this sort of encouraging type noises, and we say it's supper time, let's get going. What do you think? Mom's cooked a nice supper, and we coax our children into into obeying us, and largely that's ignoring us. Then we might get into bribery and bargaining. So it's like, okay, guys, if you pack up your toys now, then you can have ice cream tonight for supper. And we start, and that may open a negotiation, because children are hardened negotiators, and you might end up bargaining for what level of response would deserve what sort of bribe response, and generally an unproductive form of parenting. Out of frustration, we sometimes threaten. So if the bribery is not working, or we just jump to the step. So now it's like, guys, if you don't tidy up your toys and come to the table in the next 3 minutes, then you're going to go to your bed hungry. And you issue a threat in the misguided hope that your children will respond. At this point, you may have your children will start to watch you, because they know that if you've gone down this road before, that mom and dad, are trying to they're actually starting to get angry now, and at some point they will pop. So your children are now trying to evaluate you right now to see how emotional you actually are when you start threatening them. Often at this point, there'll be, if the children haven't responded, a pretense of consequence. You say like, right, that's it, no supper for you, go straight to your bedroom. And they may just ignore you at that point. Or you might, if you've said you're going to take them to the bathroom, or you're going to do this or do that, or you're going to take away the iPad, and you reach out to take it, and they take it away, reach back, and you don't follow through. There's this pretense, in a sense, a half consequence, or an incomplete consequence, where they are not, there's no actual consequence. The deep, at this point, they may be starting to think, okay, mom and dad might be getting serious. So you'll have a slow or a conditional response. Like, as Sheila was saying, that kids, they slowly put the toys away, and they do it their way. In other words, they
calling the shots.
They are calling the shots. They're rebelling against your voice. And the end result is a deep frustration and annoyance for everybody, actually. And it's a deeply frustrating thing. And so this is what happens if you're not intentional about achieving obedience with your children. And we want to, after we break in a minute or so, we really want to speak a lot about the very practical nature of how to achieve obedience with your children. Before we go there, though, I want to just make the point that obedience is not there to embitter or exasperate or frustrate your children. When Paul wrote the letter to the church in Ephesus, he gave this instruction to the children, which presumably were in the congregation: children, obey your parents. And then he coupled it with an instruction to the parents: parents, do not exasperate or embitter your children. So very clearly, the goal of obedience is not to exact or pull out obedience so that your children are frustrated and, in a sense, living in such a narrow, small box of your voice that they can only do what you tell them to do. That's not the goal of obedience. So we will bear that in mind, and we've got some practical suggestions on how you can avoid exasperating your children when you aim for this. So when we come to thinking about obedience and when you should expect it, I think all of us to some degree would expect obedience if there was an emergency. So if one of your children, for example, was running towards a busy road, you would shout stop with every expectation that your child would, and they probably would, because they'll pick up the alarm in your voice. So in a case like that, with a child who's wielding something they shouldn't, a large knife in the kitchen, or playing with an angle grinder, your authority and your voice out of the emergency, you would expect to be obeyed. And so that's a good thing. Your children will survive, but that's not really reaching the heart of the matter. Sometimes we expect obedience, but we only do it when we have the energy or the resolve to do it. In other words, you've decided that's it, we are going to do this thing. This might be this coming week. Also, you've been lectured by me, and now you're going to be like, okay, we're going to do this thing. And you drum up the resolve and the energy, and you have an extra cup of coffee in the morning, and you are psyched to achieve obedience with your children. The problem is, though, of course, your energy levels and your resolve
and your caffeine
levels will deteriorate through time. In other words, it's subject to your life also. So you might have a terrible day at work, and all sorts of horrible things happen. You come home, and now you're dealing with the tired post-school child, and you deal with all sorts of things. And now rebellion raises its heart, and they're not obeying you, but you don't have the energy to deal with it. So then you would not expect. You would just be like, I'm done, and that's it. And then sometimes it can also be we expect obedience, but we only see it when our children are feeling compliant. So there are times when they have their mood swings, and they are feeling in a good mood, and oh yeah, mom, I'll do that, no problem, and that's all happy, and everybody's got a smiley face. But actually, the heart issue isn't really being tested at that point, because you are dealing with a child who's in a very happy state. So you're not ever seeing the state of their heart, really. And so what we want to say is that obedience is not governed by any of these things. It's not by necessity, by energy levels, your emotional state, the child's emotional state, or the whim of the moment. It's governed by vision. It really is. You have to have vision for achieving obedience. And that's really been the heart of what I've been trying to say tonight, is that the reason why you want to have your children obey you is not that you can show off one day when you go to a tea party, but that your children's heart would be molded and shaped to the place that they can follow God. And it starts from a young age with your children learning to obey your voice. And you'll find that very often obedience is more difficult for you than it is for the child. In other words, that's been our experience, is that when we've tried and we've made an effort to be consistent and do all the things we're going to talk about after tea, we find our children respond quickly. They really did. It was us, we were the problem. So we would encourage you as parents, is that get yourself into the right place, mental space and all the rest of it, so that you have that vision, that you say, you know, I'm going to do this thing when I'm feeling tired, when I'm feeling strong, when the children are good or bad, what doesn't really matter. We are going to work towards a state of obedience because it's right, it's good. And once you've got yourself into that place, you'll find your children quite easily follow in behind you.
After the break, we're having a break now, 10 minutes. We're going to teach you, give you principles on how to reach first-time obedience. And I think we do have a slide that we're going to put on. But I think we're going to put the slide, because we didn't have the slides just now, of that book that we recommend of Drew and Megan. So we'll put that up now, and then we will see you at 5 to 8.
We'll be back on. Have a nice break, and we will
see you there.
notice if there's any glum-looking faces or confused people. So you must jump in as soon as it doesn't seem right. Yeah, right. So we're dealing with this business of how to train first-time obedience, and it's a very practical session, and one in which we will start tonight and also carry on into next week. So the way we put it is like this. There are 3 things you want to get right with your achievement of obedience. The 3 C's, we've called them. There's going to be communication, consistency, and consequences. And if these 3 are in place, I think you will find your children are able to achieve a measure of obedience. When it comes to obedience, though, we do notice certainly seen it in our own children, it's an ongoing thing. Yeah. In other words, you can get it right for weeks and months on end, and you seem like you feel like you've become very good parents, and then you suddenly notice that you now having to count to 3 again. And so like if you don't respond when I count to 3, then something's going to happen, or you're repeating yourself, whatever it might be, and your children are no longer responding to your instructions and requirements. So it is an ongoing process. We even into the teenage years, we're seeing our children have to go through what we're talking about now. We're still very actively doing this.
And we notice every time we teach, when we have class time, we'll look at each other and go, okay, we've got some work to do. So it really is an ongoing thing. But I want to encourage mums and dads, you've got little children, they can achieve first-time obedience when they're little. They really can. It is possible. So
right,
keep at it.
So the first point I want to make is, this is under communication. The first point is one we've spoken about many times, and we'll probably go on ad nauseum around it, is that it's important, very important, that there is unity and resolve amongst the parents. So certainly if you are a married couple, then this is vital, that you've got vision for this, that you are unified, and you have resolve, because you do have to work at this. It's something which you don't want to start and then stop and start and stop, because you'll bring confusion to your children. So it's really important that you do not proceed without unity, so that one parent is fighting for this and the other one's neglectful of this. It would be unhelpful, to be honest. So if you have to spend 3 to 4 months achieving unity between you, it's time well spent, so that you fight the same battle, if I can put it like that, the battle for your child's heart. So that's
Number
what we call first one, proactive. You're doing this long before you've started parenting.
Yeah.
This is where the parenting battle really starts, is sitting on the couch with the parents, getting this right. This one now, this is your first interaction with your children. Something we call Milo time. And the heart of Milo time is to make sure that everyone is on the same page, and it's an out of conflict conversation. That's the key aspect of this. This is not in the parenting moment where you're in reaction to something, or you've given an instruction and your child is disobeying you, and then or conditionally obeying you, and now you think, okay, well, let's all sit down and have a nice heartfelt conversation, because already emotions are running high and you, in a sense, are in reaction to a moment. So the key here is proactive. This happens long before there's a moment of disobedience, where you're going to take some time with your children and you're going to make it a happy moment. So for us in our family, Milo, our children when they were younger loved Milo, and it was a real treat. It wasn't something that they just had as much as they wanted of. And so we would say, come on guys, let's get a mug of Milo. And we would get a cup of coffee and the kids would have Milo, and we'd all sit down and there'd be marshmallows and we'd sit around the table, and it's already, in your sense, your children are in a very happy space emotionally. They're engaged with you and you're not in reaction to anything negative, we hope. And then at that point, you start to explain yourself. Why are you going down this road? And you give the explanation to an age-appropriate level. In other words, if you're explaining this to a 1-year-old, it's very, very basic language. 2-year-old, obviously, a little bit more, and you know the language that your children can understand.
I think the big thing here is to communicate your expectations. Now, remember, you've decided as a couple, or if you're a single parent, you've really thought it through. What are your expectations? And then you have to communicate them. because so often that's where breakdown in relationships happen. In marriages, in businesses, in children, and siblings, it's where expectations are not communicated. So as a parent, you say, these are our expectations. So for example, we would say, we've noticed this, that no one helps tidy up the table after lunchtime, and it's causing mom to get really frustrated. So we would highlight an issue, and then we'd say, now our expectations that each one of you would work until the table's completely cleared. And then we'd also say our expectations of where the dirty things need to go, not just dumped, and scrape off the food things, and our expectation on some little wipe the table. So it's very clear, it's very clear. It's all done in a happy voice, and everyone knows. And then, and what is really important, you do reflective listening. So then you say, what have you heard me say? And then they have to repeat back what they remember. And it's really good exercise to do, because then you can see where information has fallen through the cracks. So that you can't expect the children to reach a standard if they firstly have forgotten what you said, and secondly didn't really hear what you said, or you haven't expressed your expectations sufficiently.
And I think particularly when it comes to obedience, you want to explain the heart of this. So I would take the time to explain, certainly if my children were old enough to understand, why we're going down this route. So we're going to be along the lines of, mom and dad are going to be requiring that you obey when we give an instruction. The reason for this is not just so that we like the sound of our own voice, and I'll show them in the scriptures the need for obedience, that why God requires it, and say, and it's important. I'll show them that Ephesians 6 scripture in the writing. There it is, black and white. Children, obey your parents. So we're going to help you do that. It's again, this is not a threat, or there's no, in a sense, you're not trying to get your children to do anything at this point. You're explaining the heart behind it, and your expectations and the consequences. So we're going to talk about consequences as one of the whole sessions tomorrow, next week. But they need to know everything up front. This is the full explanation of what's going to happen, what the expectations and everything are. And it's really important. I would go so far as to say that you should not proceed into giving any instructions if you haven't, in a sense, clarified these boundaries up front, because it's again, all of this gives you very, very secure footing to parent confidently from. If you've communicated well in advance, it really, really is helpful, because then you can be so confident to be strong and to hold the course, so to speak. Okay, the next thing is still in communication, is be very clear when you give an instruction. So communicate your instructions well. So I can't think of how many times I've heard myself and many, many other parents giving instruction, or thinking they're giving an instruction, but actually they're opening a debate. So you'll hear this sort of thing. You'll tell one of your children, so little Johnny, it's time for bed. Don't you think it's time for bed? And you ask a question.
Don't you think it's a good idea to go to bed?
Yeah, got school tomorrow, and these hopeful parents sort of open a debate with a 2-year-old, and like, no, I don't think it's time to go to bed. And you totally undermine your ability to expect obedience if you ask questions. So I think it's important to give an instruction. It's not when you give an instruction, you're not giving a command in the sense of a harsh word. It's just, guys, if you say there are more than one child involved, children, it's supper time. Please pack up your toys and come to the table. So it's a reasonable instruction. It's not unreasonable that you would expect of them, and it's not phrased as a question, and very clearly would expect some sort of response. And if there wasn't a response, there would be no doubt that you're now dealing with an issue of rebellion, because or some other issue, but it's not because you've made it vague. In other words, don't be vague.
You almost in your voice have to have a tone where you expect to be obeyed, not as a disciplinarian, but just authoritarian, but just, it's bedtime or it's supper time, and it's what I want you to do.
Yeah. We found very helpful is to require a response. So often before giving the instruction, we would get our children's attention, because they can get really absorbed. Young children in particular can be involved if they're watching a movie, or if they're playing an intense game of Lego, or some make-believe moment, and they might look like they're just sitting there staring at the blank wall, but they might be engaged in a very significant imagination game, and they're actually not engaged with you. So you may give an instruction, and then they're like, and you like come storming back in, like, why didn't you obey? And then they're like, what? And they didn't hear you. Now, the moment they say, but I didn't hear you, you would be in doubt as to whether or not they did. And so we found it very helpful to sort of get into their world. And it might be literally like taking a child's head, look at me, look at mom, guys, look at mom. And then like, oh yes, everybody looks up at mom, and you give the instruction. And we would say, and then we would expect our children to say, yes, mom, or yes, dad, so that it's very clear, you very clearly have dealt with any murkiness. What you don't want to have is that if you're having to bring about a consequence, that your children start claiming ignorance of what you said, or weren't able to hear you, or anything like
Innocence.
that. Innocence. And now if there's grey areas, then suddenly we would lose confidence to bring about a consequence.
Another helpful tip is, if you do have little children, is to actually go down to their level, crouch down and look at them in the eye and engage with them. That also is helpful.
Okay. Something we found was taught to us, and an extremely helpful tip is give fair warning, so you do not exasperate your children. So, particularly if children are involved in a complex game, or if they're building a model or finishing a puzzle or something like that, then it's hard for them to just leave that and respond to your instruction. And so you know what it's like if you're in the middle of a really happy moment, and you're doing something, and you're reading a chapter of a book, or whatever it might be, and somebody comes and says, do this. Immediately in your heart, there's going to be a sense of rebellion. Now, your children will have that. Every time you give an instruction that breaks into their happy world, it's going to cause an inherent and a natural rebellious response, which they have to process. So if you're expecting an instantaneous result, you may end up with a rebellious result as opposed to what you're looking for. So it's very helpful to walk in and say, guys, in 5 minutes, I'm going to expect you to pack up your toys because it's supper time. And that gives them 5 minutes to, in a sense, emotionally disengage from their happy moment and process that rebellion, so that when you come back in and say, okay, time to pack up, it's supper time, you might have completely diffused a natural rebellious moment.
And this is where you're talking Milo time. You explain the 5-minute rule, and you give fair warning. And it's really, really helpful. So you say to them, this is what we're going to be doing. So when it's time, we want you to brush your teeth. We're going to give you 5 minutes, or whatever the instruction is. And we found that it's actually really helpful. We use it now. Even in 5 minutes, we're going, 5 minutes, you got to get ready to go. In 5 minutes, and we do the 5-minute rule. And we even now do this. We just say 5 minutes, we hold up our hand. So now we can be somewhere with our children, and we just go into the room, we look at them, catch their eye, do this, they nod, cool, and then they know. It really is helpful.
I think particularly if they're at a friend's house, like you might wrap up your time with your friends, and you just sort of lurch out your chair, okay guys, time to go, and they're like in the middle of an intense game and they don't want to go, so you might have rebellion and then frustration. So 5-minute warning, really helpful.
And if you find that you have a child who really doesn't like to go, so you find they run away or they hide, this is something that you can do in Milo time, where you can say, okay, we've noticed this thing, that whenever we go somewhere and then you don't want to go, you run away, you hide, whatever, it's incredibly frustrating, and this is what we're going to do. These are our expectations, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we expect you to do, and if you don't, this will be the following consequence. So it's laid out. And then what you do, maybe the way you drive, on the way driving to the friend's house, you say, remember what we said in Milo time? Yes, and then you get them to repeat it back, and then they say, yes, when you say it's 5 minutes, I've got 5 minutes and I mustn't do this, because if I do that, then this is going to happen. And so everyone is clear, absolutely clear what's going to happen.
Sure. And then lastly, when it comes to communication, don't repeat yourself, don't threaten your children, and don't bribe them. So you might have to rethink the way you give instructions, but just say it once and then walk away. And then if you have to, then you bring it. It's very hard.
Very hard.
And don't threaten, whether you're using words or your body language, or loom over your children, because you want them to respond to the instruction of your voice from a place of their hearts, as opposed to out of fear some negative response. So it's not you're never issuing a threat. Don't ever attach on, if you don't do this, then, you know, you're not, the understanding of the consequences is spoken about in the out of conflict Milo time. So when you give the instruction, you don't tack on the consequence as a warning, as a threat. You know, remember what I said at Milo time, if you don't do this, and you get all aggressive, and because you might get a response. They may obey you, but they won't have obeyed you from the heart. They will have obeyed because of the threat. And likewise with the bride, it's kind of obvious. Don't say, if you come, then we will da 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 da. And you'll get the response you want behavior-wise, but you won't have captured their heart. And that's the goal of all of this.
And another thing that falls into this category is for those of us who like to count. And we say, okay, I'll count to 3, and then you get to 2, 2.5, 2 3/4. And 3, and we expect our children, and all they're doing is they're just waiting because they know now they've got an extra count of 3 to get to that point. If they can obey you at 3, then they can obey you at 0. It's a hard one, but actually we often have to change, or we have to change the way we think, because first time obedience isn't on a count of 3. God doesn't say 1, 2. He's very patient, but he doesn't count.
It's not the way he works.
Yeah.
Okay, the second big C is consistency. So, you know, very clearly, we've spoken a lot about this, but both parents must be in agreement. And if you've got other major caregivers, grannies, or domestic helpers who spend a lot of time with the kids, it's really important that, in a sense, there's one standard in the home. It might sometimes, I mean, it is harder for grannies and domestic workers, but it is important, I think, that they would at least be partially in this arena, and your kids are able to obey all the caregivers. To me, that's vital, but that does require quite a lot of work with particularly grannies, I find. But that's grandparents are allowed to be like that. So, all right. So what you find is that you've set the boundaries. So you've agreed as parents, this is what you're doing. You've discussed it with the children. You've presented it as best you can in a happy moment. The consequences have already been set. Now you just have to be consistent 100% all the time, every time. And this is where it's really helpful to have resolved in your heart to do this, because you might end up, in a sense, bringing about a consequence literally tens and tens of times in a day. I mean, we had children, a child in particular, I think of, where you would just say, do this, and they just wouldn't do it, and they just wouldn't do it. They'd get the consequence of the consequence, and just the same thing would happen again. And occasionally we would change things because we would think we weren't getting their hearts. But today, it's borne fruit. They remarkably, we've got their hearts, which is important. So it's just necessary to be consistent in all of this. What you want to avoid is that you are, one day you're like this, and the next day you lax, and the next day you're strict, and then you'll actually create a great level of insecurity amongst your children. So whatever you are doing, just do it all the time. Yes. And it's important that you would be consistent. So what you want to avoid is also avoid negotiating under conflict. So in this instance, I mean, the pictures I put up there would describe the First World War, the big trenches. That map would show each line was a trench line filled with men. And all that would happen is if one side sort of charged over and took over the trench, and there was a retreat from the other side, and then they would establish a new line, and then they would just push to the next line. And your parenting can be like that. If you negotiate, in a sense, under conflict, if you back down from a consequence or from a moment where you've done everything up until that point, like we've talked about, proactively, and you've done the best you can, and then now you're tempted to draw back from the line in the sand that you've drawn. If you do that, all that happens is your children will step forward to that new line, and you'll fight the same battle again. And that's really what you want to do, is hold the line. It's just you can do this safely if you've done everything we've talked about up front, where you've thought about it, and you've talked about it, and you've prayed about it, and you've got unity, and blah 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 blah. Then you can hold that line because it's the right line. God's given it to you, so defend it. And you're not doing this to battle against your children. You're doing this to battle for your children. You're wanting to win their hearts to obedience. So it's important that you would do this. And if you ever find yourself backing down, thinking, oh, what's the point of requiring my children to eat at a high chair. This is like in the bigger picture of things. Does this really matter that they would obey me on this issue? Probably find that you're backing down because of a parental energy level as opposed to the rightness of, irrespective of whether or not eating at a high chair is an issue. The point is you've required obedience because you're shaping something in their heart. And it's really important to actually, we'll speak a lot more about this in coming sessions, but look at all the aspects of your daily life and look for every opportunity where you can reasonably require obedience. Because in doing so, you're not aiming for these perfectly behaved children. You're aiming for children who have to learn to obey you. And so, if you can have many options to do that, then you turn your daily life into moments requiring obedience. Then that's helpful. You've got you'll win their hearts. Okay, and then. Related to this is choose your battles very carefully. So if any of you have any understanding of or knowledge of the Second World War, the history of the Second World War, there was people who've looked at the strategies, said there was a single moment, a single decision that ruined Germany's chances of actually being victorious across Europe. And it was when they split their army and they, instead of just attacking to the west, they went to the east into Russia also. And they opened up an entire new battleground. And that was the turning point. The rest was a question of time before their resources.
Because
they split their resources. So you might have listened to everything we've said tonight and thought about 40 things that you want to bring about change in your family and your children. And that you're thinking, okay, we're going to require obedience at the table and at bedtime and schoolwork, and every time I tell them to do this and pick up the dog poo, blah, 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 whatever it might be. And there's this buzz of activity that you're going to visit upon your children and absolutely destroy yourself and potentially your children. So what you want to do is in your couch time, think about one issue that you're going to win this one. And actually make it quite a low-hanging fruit. It doesn't have to be the biggest issue, but you want to get a win under your belt. You want to get some success because it's so much nicer to celebrate success than it is to constantly be correcting your children. So take an area where you think you might achieve obedience quite easily. And so let's just say, for example, you have a child that it's not a problem to turn off the TV and come to supper. It's not a major battle of the heart. So then you would do the whole couch time, the Milo time, and you explain it all. And then when you call them with a happy heart, they come to the table and they've turned the TV off. And it was an easy win. Because now you can celebrate that. And I can tell you now that you get far more success celebrating, you get much more fruit celebrating success than you do bringing about constant correction. So it's so much nicer to be able to say to kids, I just love the way you obeyed with a happy heart. Thank you. And that affirmation just warms something in your child and they'll want to do it again. So choose your initial battles very, very carefully, aiming for early successes that you can celebrate and then move on to greater things. Don't open up multiple battlegrounds simultaneously because you will exasperate your children. They won't know what's hit them. And also you'll drain yourself.
Yeah, your resources will go east and west, north and south and all over.
Yeah. Okay. So the last of the C's we want to deal with is consequences. And I don't know about you, but if you've noticed anything of life, is that there are always consequences to all our actions. And some of them are positive and some of them are negatives. So the reality is, the concept of having consequences happen to us is not foreign. It's not like this is an artificial thing.
Consequences are the best thing we can do for our children, not the best, but one of the best things we can do is to teach our children about consequences. Because if we're always trying to protect our children from consequences, they're going to get a very rude awakening when they're older. Because if they've never been taught that there are consequences, maybe when they start arriving at work late or they don't do their job properly and they start getting reprimanded or even fired, it will be such a big thing. So just it's so easy that we want to just protect our children and always want them to be happy. We almost like especially I find as a mom, I tend to migrate towards child-centered parenting. But actually, when your child does leave their snack at home and they have to be hungry at school, it's a good thing because they'll learn. Whereas if they know that if they phone mum and she's going to be there with their sports kit and their homework that they left and everything else at school when they need it and there's no consequence, then they don't actually learn that life is unfair.
Yeah. And as I say, there are some positive ones and there are some negative ones, so that you it's even when you're giving a if your child has done something good and you're able to celebrate and affirm them and call out all the good that you're seeing in them, that is such a positive thing. I mean, all of us love to receive encouragement and the recognition when we've done well.
Yeah.
In our hearts, we all know that, and you receive it so well, and it's so the both are really important. Okay, so so what we find is in our in the application of consequences, when you are applying them, you want to remind them. This is particularly if the consequence is a negative one that you are bringing about because they have been disobedient. You would remind them of the Milo time, where you say, guys, do you remember what we spoke about 3 days ago when we had Milo together? And hopefully they'll be like, yeah. And then at that point, get them to remember the agreed consequences. So you would say, so what did we agree would happen if you disobeyed me? And then they'll have to think, and they won't want to say it, of course, so they might, but at the end of the day, you want them to actually then to verbalize what the agreed consequence was. And then you apply it. Without anger, this is not an angry moment at all. There shouldn't be any excessive emotion here. I mean, there is emotion because there's two people involved, but it's not excessive emotion. If you find you are angry, then back away for time. Don't the consequence should be applied, but don't ever do it out of anger. So our children can drive us to high levels of frustration and anger. And if you need to deal with yourself in your own heart first, it's okay to do that. It really is. You're also human, and but don't ever apply the consequence in a way that the child would feel your very strong, angry emotion. You don't really want to do that.
There were times when I would say to the children, I just need to go and think about this. I'll come back, and I just let them sit there whilst I sort of got myself in check. And then I was able to say, okay, no, this is the consequence. And I could do it calmly and actually with much love. And actually almost say, I'm sorry that this is happening, but actually you've chosen to do it because you knew what the consequence was. And now I'm sorry, but we've got to follow through.
And I just had a thought about going back to the Milo time when you're doing this in advance. When you come to actually discussing the consequences, this is at Milo time, get your children to ask them the question. You say, okay, if in this area of where we're going to be requiring obedience, let's just say it was packing up toys and coming to supper, what do you think the consequences should be if you don't obey me? And let them come up with the consequences. But I tell you, children can be quite harsh on themselves. So they'll be, oh no, well then I should be this, I should be that, and that thing, and you like just write it all down. And then you would just remind them of the moment. And
that's really helpful for teenagers, young adults, where you sit down and you say, okay, so let's say, yeah, you can go out on Saturday nights, and this is the time you've got to be back. But if not, this is the consequence. Then you sit and you discuss together, and they decide what the curfew is and what if they break it. And that's really, really helpful. And some parents actually write out a contract with their young adults, and they get them to sign. And it's almost stuck up on somewhere in the house, so that when they do come home half an hour after curfew, they show dad or mum will show them the contract, and then they know exactly what the consequence is, and it's done with this. It just takes away all the emotion. It's really helpful.
And the decision, and the in the moment decision making, which can undermine us as we try to think, oh no, what should I do? You know, if you've thought about it all up front and you've agreed about it all up front. And we never had written contracts, but we did talk about things. But but we know of parents who did. They literally would have a negotiated contract up front with every year. And so these are going to be the boundaries. They would discuss it all. They would negotiate it and agree on the consequences. And it just cleared the air completely. And when they came to applying the consequences, when there was a transgression, then there wasn't like a break in relationship, because the child knew they had done wrong. And they just like, well, I got to, it was fine. So related to this, though, is always be fair. So sometimes there is opportunity for appeal. And what I mean by that is that, there are instances where you don't want, where the child has, in a sense, broken the letter of the law, but they did it with reason. And you want to hear that reason, because if you are always exacting the letter of the law and not understanding the heart of the matter, then you will frustrate or exasperate your children. So I think of that example of the child I mentioned earlier on about he wouldn't go out and do the compost heap at night. There was a reason that wasn't rebellion, that why he rejected the instruction. And it would be helpful to know that. So, for example, let's say you come in and you give an instruction to your children, please turn off the TV, it's supper time, supper's on the table. And they say, but Mom, we've got 3 minutes to go to the end of the program. So in that instance, it would make sense to just let that play out, because otherwise you will transgress as the parents the instruction. Don't exasperate your children. So what might be that I've given the children an instruction and they're going off to do it, and then next thing Mom cuts in and says, have you done the washing up? Why haven't you done the washing up? And breaks it. Now the children have got conflict in instructions, and they might want to be able to say, well, Dad said this, whatever. The point is, just be fair in all of this. Don't give in to excuses, but listen to your children so that you're not frustrating them at the end of the day. If your mannerism and if your way of doing this is exasperating your children unfairly, then you're going to lose the battle. So you really need to get this right. And then lastly, there's a whole load of toolbox. So this is going to be the heart of next week's session, is we're going to unpack the toolbox. So we've used this word consequences sort of quite vaguely, and we'll try to bring a lot of clarity to it. Just to put it out there up front, there are a whole lot of things that are proactive consequences. In other words, they, in a sense, take place or they're put in place before the event. There's a whole lot of reactive ones where you're in reaction to a moment, and some of them are structured. In other words, you bring them about, you impose them on your children, and other ones are natural. So just as an example of the latter one, a natural consequence might be, you would say to your children, don't run around the pool, it's slippery. They run around the pool, they slip, they graze their knee. So once you've glanced over, the blood loss is minimal and they haven't broken anything, at that point your sympathy can stop, because there literally was, well, I told you not to do that. And you let the natural consequence flow. Another example might be, if you say to your child, pack up your toys because Dad's coming home in the car, and you don't want him to drive over the toys if they're playing in the driveway, and they don't do it, and Dad comes home and crushes one of the toys, there's no rushing to the shop the next day to replace the toy. It's just a natural consequence. You disobeyed, there it is. Whereas structured consequences might be, well, if you don't come to the table, then you don't get any. The consequence might be that you don't get pudding that night, whatever it might be that you've agreed, and that's imposed. You've brought it about. And
just one last thing, because I'm thinking of all us doing school with our children. If you're not a homeschooling mom previously, before lockdown, advice that was given to me years ago, because I homeschooled my kids, is someone very wisely said, don't ever use schoolwork as a consequence for bad behavior. So for example, let's say they're supposed to be doing their maths and they're just not listening, and they're wriggling and they're causing chaos and they're not actually working. Maybe a natural response is, oh, well, then you must do 10 pages of maths instead of 2, because we want them to really understand this is important. But actually what happens is that consequence ends up making the child hate maths. They're never going to want to do maths. Rather, this wise lady said, shut the book, Sheila, with your children, and then pray and ask God to bring that behavior up somewhere else in your parenting day and deal with the root cause, because there's probably a root cause as to why they aren't really behaving in that moment. But don't use schoolwork as a bribe or
really a bribe. Threat.
A threat, sorry. Yeah.
If to do more maths, you can have extra pudding tonight.
Richard wants pudding. He wants pudding.
Yeah, clearly. And okay, so that is the 3 C's of getting discipline right. You want to be able to, you want to communicate everything, so it's all very clear. You want to be consistent all the time, and you want to understand the wise use of consequences. So we've only touched on consequences tonight, and as I say, we'll tackle that in a lot more detail, the full package of the toolbox that you can use for your kids. So as we come into land, don't forget couch time. It's vitally important part of everything we say is that you would be unified in this time. And if you need to leave, that's fine. We're going to shut down the slideshow and hang around for some time afterwards on Zoom, and you are welcome to interact with us there.
And we'll send through some discussion points for couch time this week with regard to communicating our expectations and things like that, but we'll send it through.
Have a lovely week, and we'll see you next week.